Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So, in today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish, and it's going to be a really open ended session. So, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just hold on, we've got a question. You can either send it through the chat or you can unmute yourself, whatever's easier. So someone asked a question in doing personal care POA, where do you put in the comment that the client does not want to be kept alive by artificial means? So I would just manually edit that in the document itself. So once you generate, there'll be a clause on that, and then you can just generate that clause. Okay, so once you log into the system, this is the screen that you're going to get to, and it's going to list all the different clients that you've added in. So to add a new client, you're just going to go to this add button and then type in the client's first name and last name. Middle name, you can put it in, but you don't need to in order to add the client to the system. And then there's the email field, and this is here if you want to send the client the questionnaire. So you'd put in their email, you'd click this use questionnaire button, and then when you went to add them to the system, you'd have a prompt as to how you wanted to send them the questionnaire. So either you can have it sent directly from eState Planner, or you can um, choose the option where you can copy a link and send them that link from your own email. So it just depends on what you want to do. There's a bit more customization if you send it from your own email, but you can also just send it from the system. And then the client's going to receive that link and they're going to click on it and they'll be prompted to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to do it all in one sitting. And then they go through and enter their family tree, profile, asset, and debt information. And anything they put in that online questionnaire is going to automatically populate back into your system. So it's going to save a lot of time that way. So you don't have to send the questionnaire if you don't want to. If you have older clients, if you like to use your own questionnaire, you can just use that instead and just don't worry about putting the email field and clicking that use questionnaire box and it won't send the client a questionnaire. And we'll just go ahead and add. So today, since we're doing a spouse client file, this means that we're doing wills for both spouses. And if you're doing wills for both spouses, you want to add them both as separate clients to the system and link them together using the spouse client function. So we're going to go up to this add button and we're going to add in Lauren, the spouse, because we're going to be doing her will as well. And then the key thing for any spouse client is this spouse client field right here. So you're going to have to add the first spouse in normally so that when you're adding the second spouse, the first spouse's name is already in the system. So you'll be able to just select them from this drop down list and that'll link them together, which means that any shared family tree or joint asset information will automatically populate in both of their profiles. And then you also are going to have the opportunity to sync scenarios and appointments if it's going to be like a mirror will plan. So it's going to save a lot of time that way. And then you just have to decide who you want to start with. So I'm going to start with Ben. So I'll just click on his name and it'll bring me into his profile. And this is what you're going to see if you haven't sent the client the questionnaire or if you have, but they haven't filled it out yet. So you're going to have the client's icon and the spouse's icon. And what I usually like to do first is edit the client's information. And you can do this by just double clicking right on the client's icon. And really, for anyone on the family tree, the key fields are going to be first name, last name, and gender so that the wording of the will comes out properly. For the client specifically, the AKA field will also populate. So Ben's also known as Benny Collins, that will populate in the will. Date of birth, you can just type it in this field. I find that the easiest way to do this, and then it'll automatically populate the age for you. Country of birth, citizenship, all this other stuff. This is good information to have on your client, but it's not going to affect the generation of the will itself. Then residency. So province is important because however you set the province as here is how the system's going to know to calculate the probate tax throughout the system. but also it's how the system's going to know which precedent to generate. So if you're from Nova Scotia or BC or Alberta, you're going to want to make sure the province is changed to the correct province to make sure your correct precedents are generating. This city field's also important because it will populate in the will. So it'll say Ben Collins of the City of Toronto. Special circumstances for the client is a place where you could note down potential capacity issues so that you've got this stuff really well documented in case there's going to be a will challenge down the line. And relationships is just going to tell you who the client's related to. Then we'll just go ahead and save. So let's say we wanted to add a child. Whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. And to get the blue circle around somebody, you just click once on their icon. And then you go up to the add button, and then you go child. And whenever you're adding a child, you're going to get this prompt as to who the other parent is. So is it Lauren, the current spouse? Is it a new parent, so an ex-spouse that is going to be involved in the will, so you want to add them to the family tree? Or a single parent, so either the ex-spouse isn't going to be involved in the will, so you don't want to add them, or they're genuinely a single parent. But let's just say it's Lauren. And then we'll type in the child's information. John Collins, male, date of birth, July 19th, 2000. And then the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client is a place where you can note sort of estrangement or relationship difficulties to the client. But most importantly is this disability box. So if this individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure this box is checked off so that later on, if you're trying to do a Henson trust, the system's going to pick up on the fact that you're gifting it to a disabled beneficiary and you're creating this trust that's fully discretionary to the death of the beneficiary. And it will draft a special Henson trust clause in the will. So you have to make sure this box is checked off so the system's able to recognize what you're trying to do. Then let's say you wanted to add a grandchild. So you can't just add a grandchild directly to the client. What you have to do is add a child to the client, click on the child's icon, and add a child to that child. I'm going to say he's a single parent. And this is how you would get the grandchild's information in the system. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You would click on the client's icon, you would add a sibling to the client, you'd click on the sibling's icon and add a child to the sibling. If there's going to be anybody else involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity, but they're not family, or they're really distantly related and you don't want to build out the whole family tree just to get to them, you can click on this All tab up in the top corner, and then it's going to list everybody that you've added into the system. And to add someone new, you just go up to the Add button. Let's say Jordy's going to be involved in this will later on somehow. So we will just type in Jordy Ayton, male. We'll add him in, and then it'll ask us who the relationship is. So if Jordy's related to Ben, and the relationship is he's a friend of Ben's. And that way you get him in the system. So later on, when we're choosing beneficiaries or trustees, we'll be able to choose him as one of the options from the drop-down list. So that's the People tab. Any questions here so far? Nope? Okay. Well, don't be shy if you do have any questions. Next, we'll go to assets. So this is where you're going to list all of the different clients' assets that they have. And you're always going to start with the general personal effects, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will so that it triggers a special general personal effects clause. For any other assets, what you can do is add in all the client's assets that they have and give them values and give them a sense of what the net value of their estate's looking like at this point in time. But for the will generation purposes itself, the only assets that you need to add here are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want to confirm or do new designations for in the will. So let's add a couple in. We'll start with a bank account. So really for any asset that you're adding into the system, the bank account field, that's the key, the where it says bank account, because the asset name field is the most important because it's how the asset's going to be referred to throughout the system and in the will if you're gifting it as a specific asset bequest. So instead of just leaving it as called bank account or bank account copy, I like to put all the identifying information in. So maybe it's the RBC bank account, whatever the account number is. So that way, if I'm adding in multiple bank accounts, I don't get confused as to which is which. I know this is the RBC bank account, the other is the CIBC savings account, and that way I can make sure I'm planning for the right asset. Balance, you don't have to put it in, but you can. It'll make the graphic summary look a lot nicer, and it'll automatically calculate the probate tax for you based on whatever you've set the client's residency as. So this is based on Ontario law. Next, let's go for real estate, a home. So again, maybe they have multiple homes. Maybe this one's the family home. You could change that asset name if you want. The address field for property, if you're adding it as a specific asset bequest, it will populate in the will. So you can fill out that field there. Current value, let's say it's $1 million. So you also have this mortgage / encumbrances field when you're dealing with property. And if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of the mortgage in this field here and not as a separate debt on the debts tab. So the reason being is because when you put it in here, it's good to know sort of what asset the debt is associated with, but also it will have an effect on how much probate tax is calculated for this asset. But one thing you want to make sure you're not doing is adding it in both sections. So don't put it in as a value here and add it as a separate debt on the debts tab because it will double count it. So best practice is if you're adding it in the asset, just put it in this field here. Ownership, you can change if it's joint, tenants in common, and then you can indicate who the other owner is. So I'm going to say it's Lauren, and it will now appear in Lauren's list of assets in her profile because it's joint and the two are connected. Let's go for one more. We'll go for an RRSP. So again, we're going to change the asset name to include all the information. It's the RBC RRSP. The beneficiary field, this is just for information purposes. It's not going to affect the generation of the will itself. Okay, we've got another question. If the client has a very specific list of items of jewelry to be given to specific donees, instead of making a reference to a list / memorandum to be included in the will, should we list each specific piece of jewelry and who it goes to? So when you're dealing with specific personal effects, usually it's best to just deal with some sort of memorandum. But if you want to include it in the will, you can. You would just add each piece of jewelry as a specific personal effect instead of a general personal effect. And you would just rename it to, like, this is mom's necklace, this is the diamond earring, and then you could gift those specifically in the initial gift section. It would just make a lot longer of a will. So it just depends on the client's preferences. Usually it would probably be done in a precatory memo, but if you wanted, you could include it in the will. But yeah, you would just add it as a specific personal effect on the assets tab. So you'd add them all in. And then when we get to the scenarios, you would gift them as initial gifts to the correct beneficiary. But back to the RRSP, for the beneficiary field, this is just information. So later on, we'll be able to choose whether we want to confirm this designation or do a new designation in the will. Current value, let's say it's 100,000. So the probate tax always automatically calculates for you, but the income tax doesn't, and that's just due to the variability of different clients' tax bracket. So what we usually like to do is estimate sort of the highest possible tax that the asset could incur. So for something like an RSP, we'd put in like 50% of that. For something like an asset with a capital gain, we do like 25% of that gain, just to show them sort of an estimate of the highest possible tax they're looking at. So that's the assets tab. Any other questions here? Nope, we'll keep going. So the next section is debts. It's really more for planning. It's not going to affect the generation of the will itself. If you wanted to add any debts, you just go to add debt. We're not going to put in the mortgage because we already put it on the assets tab and we don't want to double count it. But let's say there's a credit card debt of $5,000 and we'll just add that in. Then we'll get to scenarios. So this is really where all of the planning occurs. And the idea is, at most, depending on your client's situation, you're going to create a plan for each of these three scenarios so that you're covered no matter what happens when the client passes. So the first one is surviving spouse. So this is what happens when the spouse is still alive when the client's passed away. Then descendants only, so no client, no spouse, but there's kids or grandkids around. And then lastly, no descendants. This is like your ultimate disaster clause. Once everyone's gone, who's it going to? And there's two ways you can go about doing this. You can go through it manually by clicking into a scenario and going through each of the sections. So there's the joint designated assets section, where you're going to put anything that's joint or designated to another individual and therefore falling outside of the estate. There's the initial gift section, where you're going to create your specific asset bequests and your cash legacies. And then there's the balance of the estate. So this is the residue. So you're either dividing it up by adding segments and gifts within the segments, if it's a more sort of specific residue breakdown, or you're running a macro if it's sort of more of a simpler one and it matches one that's already in our list of macros. It's a faster way to do it. So you can do it that way, or an even faster way to do it and go through all the scenarios is by using ePlans. And ePlans is this little lightning bolt up in the top right corner. And they're basically giant macros that go through the scenarios and appointments section and create a plan for you based on whichever one you select. And the nice thing about it is, even if the ePlan doesn't match the exact details of what you're trying to create, if you're dealing with the typical client situation where it's like everything to spouse, everything to kids, then it can really save you a lot of time because you could run it and then you can go in and change any details that you want. But that way you're not starting from scratch. So I'm going to run this one. And now we can already see there's been changes in the surviving spouse. So what it's done in the joint designated asset section is it's given the designated and joint asset to Lauren, so it's falling outside of the estate. Initial gifts, it's given the general personal effects to Lauren because that's how you generate the special general personal effects clause coming up in the will. You have to make sure it's gifted as the initial gift section. And then balance of the estate, we'll click on segment 1. We can see the beneficiary is the spouse, absolute, 100%. And we don't need to put in a gift over here because the second scenario, the descendants only scenario, is the gift over, so we don't need to deal with this here. So I didn't need to make any change to this scenario. This looks good to go, so I can just move to the next one. In this one, in initial gifts, it's going to give the general personal effects to the children so that it's generating that special personal effects clause. But let me just show you how you would do it manually if you had to. You're just going to drag and drop it over. And you can pick your beneficiaries, or you can use classes if you want. We do the class of children. And it's absolute. And now you can specify a distribution method. So maybe we just want to leave the distribution up to the trustee's discretion. And then we'll add that in. And then the balance of the estate, you can just click on the gray bars whenever you want to see the details. It's going to the children in a trust, 100%. Same trustees as executors. The duration is when they reach 30, but I'm going to change it to 25. And then staged lump sums, I'm going to change this to at 21, they get 25%. Unlimited discretion, gift over first to beneficiaries issue, then if not, to the other class members, the other children. And then I'll save. So now I've worked off of the ePlan, but I've ultimately created the trust that I wanted to create. So I've saved a lot of time from having to start from scratch. And if I want to sync this descendants only scenario over to Lauren's descendants only scenario, so if she's going to want the same plan, I just click on this button and it's going to copy over the residue breakdown, anything that's joint between the two. The only thing it's not going to copy over are solely owned assets because it's not their asset to give away. So that can save a lot of time too, so that when you're reviewing Lauren's information, it's going to already be planned pretty much. Then we'll go to the no descendants. So technically I could just clear this and leave it. I don't have to plan for this scenario. Maybe I have a really big family. I don't think it's ever going to get to this point. But let's just say I want to create a plan. I'm going to give half to Jordy, half to a charity. So I'm not going to run a macro because it's more of a complicated breakdown. What I'm going to do is add segments and create gifts within the segments. And since I'm giving it 50-50, I'm going to start with segment 1 for 50%. Now, whenever I create a segment, I have to add a gift to specify what's happening with this segment. So what's happening with this first 50%? I'm going to pick my beneficiary, absolute, 100%. This means 100% of the 50% segment is going to Jordy, so I don't want to divide up this 50% any further. And let's put a gift over to his issue, and then we'll add. So now of the 50%, I've dealt with 100% of it. So I don't want to add any more gifts. What I want to do is go back to the segments and create my second segment to deal with the other 50%. And I'm going to add a gift. I'm going to go for a charity. And if you search in the search bar, it's going to search the CRA database for you, and it'll have all of the information that you need. So I'm going to give it to Epilepsy Toronto, and then absolute 100%, and I'll add. And if Lauren's going to want the same for hers, we're going to sync this scenario over to hers. So her no descendant scenario will be the same as well. So that's the scenarios section. I know it can get a bit tricky, but does anyone have any questions here? Nope. Okay, we'll keep going then. Next is appointments. So this is where you're going to appoint your state trustees or your guardians. And because we ran that e-plan, it's already made the spouse the primary estate trustee. So to add anybody else, you're just going to go to the add button. You can do other people or trust corporations, and their specific trust provisions will populate in the will. We're going to have Jordy going to be our first alternate. And so condition is what makes them either a primary or an alternate. So none means they're going to be a primary. If you put a condition, they'll be an alternate. So I'm usually choose if all specified cannot act, and then I just make sure the name on the specified line is correct. So it's going to go Lauren if Lauren can't, Jordy. Then I could do a further alternate if I wanted. I'm going to say same condition, but I'm going to make the specified as Jordy. So now it's going to go Lauren if Lauren can't, Jordy if Jordy can't, John. And I can sync this over to Lauren up in the top left. Then the last thing we're going to review today is provisions. So there's a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those in the will, you can just type them on the line. If not, you can get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. Include future members is if you are using class gifts in the will and you want future members of that class to be included in the definition. So if I check this box, it's going to define children in the will as John Collins and any other child born to me and my spouse. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. This is your general trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. It's going to guide underage beneficiaries you haven't set up specific trusts for in the will. So if it ends up going to like a grandchild or something like that through a gift over, it'll follow this general clause. And this is secondary will assets. So if you're doing multiple wills, primary and secondary, here's where you could pick and choose which secondary, which definitions you want included in the secondary will. So if you're just doing a single will, you don't have to check or uncheck anything. It's not going to have any effect. Then up here in the top corner, we have our little exclamation point in the circle button. And these are our advisor insights. And it's like contextual advice that's helps you to make sure you haven't missed any important planning things. Some of them will always be there, like this request prior wills and powers of attorney, but some of them can go away. So if it tells you forgot put in a gender or residency or something, if you went back and changed it, then it would disappear from the list. You don't have to make them all disappear or anything like that. It's just sort of to advise you to make sure you can be more confident in your plan. Beside that is just the notes function. So you can add notes on your client here, and these notes populate at the end of the text summary. And then your last button is your generation button. So this is where you generate all your documents and your summaries. So first off, there's three summaries you can generate. There's the profile, which is going to give you all the information on the people in the family tree, all of the spellings and stuff like that. Everybody in the assets, all the asset details, and the deaths as well. Um, we have another question. So if I'll get to the courses, so I'll address that at the end. Um, the second scenario that you can generate, the second summary, sorry, is the graphic scenario summary. So for each of the scenarios, it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will. And if you're putting in values on the assets tab, it's going to look a lot nicer. It's going to give you a sense of what's going where. And then the last one is the text scenario summary. So it's going to give you all the information on everything you've done in the will. So who you've appointed as state trustees, what gifts you've created, how you've divided up the residue. So it's just got all of those details. It's like the will without the legalese. So those are the summaries. So then you can go to documents. These are all the different documents you can generate with the system. I'm going to do single will today. So the signing date, you can always change it or you can take it out completely and manually put it in later. Registered asset designation. This is if you want to confirm or do new designations for the registered assets in the will. Make sure this is checked off. Joint designated asset confirmation is basically something that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held on resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing a counterpart. Simplified is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice chart at the end of the will that guides to the different clauses. And a cover page is a cover page. And then for witnesses, you could pick anyone who's a user on your account, or you can just pick this blank box and you can manually enter their information in the will. Then you hit generate. It's going to give you a Word document that's fully editable, so you can make any changes that you want. First, you've got this funds and plans. This is if you check the registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will if you click the joint asset box. Here's our definitions. My children means John Collins and any other child born to or adopted by, because we click that future children box on the provisions tab. Here's our appointments. Lauren, if not Lauren, Jordy, if not Jordy, John. Here's our funeral arrangement. Here's the special personal effects clause that generates. Here's the residue. So Lauren, if not Lauren, this trust for the children. And then ultimately half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And if we scroll to the bottom, we'll get to the will guide. That's a nice guide to the different clauses in the will. So that's how you would go through it. Then you'd switch over to Lauren's, check over her information, and generate her documents as well. The one thing I do want to point out before we go is this little question mark button up in the top corner. So if you click on it, it's going to bring you over to our help desk where you've got lots of different articles on how to do different things in the system. It's also got courses. So these are great because they can help to teach you more about the system for the certification course and more about estate planning in general for the fundamentals of the estate planning course. This one will give you an hour of substantive, and this one doesn't have any CPD yet. But if you are trying to get to know this course or the system better, I would definitely recommend taking this course because it takes you through client file and all the sections in depth, and it'll really give you a better sense of how to do everything in the system. So that about wraps it up. Does anyone have any final questions before we go? Nope. Okay, well, if you do come across anything later, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help. So you can either email support, you can email me directly, and we're happy to jump on a Zoom and help you out. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.